Hello, Blazor fans. Welcome to another Blazor Power Hour. I'm Ed Charbonneau, and today I'm going to take you through a new .NET 8 feature called Blazor Static Rendering. So this was a update that dropped with one of the previews. And let me share my screen here, and we will hop over to Daniel Roth's GitHub page. And on Daniel Roth's GitHub page, I'll share this in chat as well. He has a repo called Razor HTML Rendering. And we're going to use this as a guide because we're in some very undocumented territory. There's some like preliminary docs out there, but this is probably the best source for documentation right now. And then there are also the preview releases that you can find at devblogs.microsoft.com. And I believe he blogged about it in one of the preview releases as well. Drop that in chat too. And then you can look through some of these preview announcements and find lots of brand new Blazor goodies. But in the new .NET 8 previews, if you go to the .NET tab here, especially if you click on Blazor, you will see that we have ASP.NET Core updates in Preview 6, Preview 5, Preview 4, and we go all the way back. And I don't, again, remember which preview this came out in. We could probably figure that out by looking at the repo itself, because under the CS proj file here, let's see, it just says .NET 8 Preview 6 has been updated to the latest bits. So it says about 4 months ago, and then 3 weeks ago, Daniel updated to Preview 6. We look at the Git commit history. Let's see what the initial commit was. So in Preview 3, this shipped. Thank you, GitHub, for clearing that up. If we go back to the blogs, we might be able to get a little bit of documentation in here. Server rendered components outside of ASP.NET Core. So if we look in here, we'll probably find the same code that is in the sample. Let's see, server-side rendering, render components outside of ASP.NET Core. So this is a pre-release thing. Mileage may vary. You might run into some issues along the way. But for all intents and purposes, you're going to want to have a project file that has the Razor SDK enabled, because you're going to be editing Razor components. You're going to want to edit these Razor components. And for the compiler to recognize Razor components, you need the Razor SDK on your project. So make sure you have the Razor SDK there. Then we can add Razor components to the project. You may know these as Blazor components. They're essentially the same thing. The correct terminology is Razor component, though. And then there are some prerequisites for having this to work. So we need a service provider. Normal ASP.NET applications come with this, so we won't need to worry about it if we're running like an ASP.NET web server, like a web API project, a Blazor server-side rendered project. We'll have that, and it requires the iLogger factory as well. Once we have these two services set up, we can pass those into an HTML renderer, and then we can tell the HTML renderer what to render. And this is where things get pretty cool, because we can render Razor components to static text. That means we can pre-render HTML from Razor components. We could build like a static site system if we wanted to, because we can render these components out and then save them to disk, essentially. You could save them as flat HTML files. Another thing we could do is render those out into memory and use them for like HTML email templates, which is really cool. So let's take a look at how we might get started with something like this. Let's start up a new project here. Got Visual Studio. You're going to need Visual Studio Preview, by the way. And with Visual Studio Preview, let me pull up the VS installer. I noticed even though I had the preview SDKs installed, I hit the wrong button here. It came up on my other monitor. Give me one sec. Visual Studio installer. Even though I had the latest SDKs installed, the preview SDKs, for some reason I wasn't getting the new Blazor templates. So I went ahead and modified my workloads in here. If you click on .NET Development and go into individual components, I had to have the .NET 8 runtime available here before those templates showed up. I don't recall having that issue before. Maybe it was just a quirky thing that happened to me this morning, but but it happened. So just be aware of that. Hey, Thindle, welcome. So all of my fancy enterprise licenses come from the Microsoft MVP program. So I am fortunate to have all of the Microsoft sponsored things because of the MVP program. MVPs get access to a big library of software from Microsoft and some third-party vendors. Some real great ones out there that are community driven as well. Like huge shout out to Markdown Monster for supporting MVPs. Rick Strahl offers his software for free to MVPs. It's a killer Markdown editor. Love it. We do get a full MSDN subscription with lots of bells and whistles. Get a little bit of Azure time and some other nice things. All right. So we've got a very blank Visual Studio right now. So one thing we need to do here is we need to create a new project. And you could do this with pretty much any template. As long as you enable the Blazor SDK on it. We could start with a Blazor web app. And this is a new template. Every day, eh? The Blazor web app is the new template that's shipping with .NET 8. This is actually probably my preferred way to do this right now. You could also do it with the traditional like Blazor WebAssembly app with a host, an ASP.NET host. So you want to have a web server of some kind to utilize this. You could also run it as a console application if you were doing something like a static site generating tool. You'd probably want to use the console app. I want to stick in the Blazor world and talk about maybe doing like an HTML template. So let's go ahead with the Blazor web app. It'll also give me a chance to show off some of the new Blazor .NET 8 stuff that's in here. You know, .NET can't send emails anymore. I think this was a old .NET thing that we used to be able to do. We can generate the email templates. We need something like SendGrid. I probably won't go over all that today, but at least we can generate some HTML and show how that would be used in an email. Let's see, we got .NET 8 preview, and I'm going to check use interactive server-side components here, and this is going to give us a pretty interesting new template that comes with .NET 8 previews. Oh, Thindle, I caught you. You're playing video games. You're not watching me. I just saw Thindle come up on Steam playing a game in the background. He's only partially paying attention, folks. All right. Enough spying on Thindle. We'll go ahead and shut Steam down in the background. I don't need any extra stuff running while I'm trying to do this anyway. So if we want to add this feature, so what the object is here is I want to add this feature because I want to be able to do email templates where I can just utilize Razor components, render that component into an HTML email, and then send that on to a third-party service to do the actual email part. So we could look at some of the APIs maybe for those and see what they look like, but basically they have stuff like, what's the to address, from address, and then your attachment, anything like that, the body of the email, and the body of the email is where we would be focused. So what do we have in our project so far? Let's get our little zoom tool and see what is in this section over here on the left-hand side. I've got my www root folder. We've got models, pages shared. And many of you that have done Blazor before probably like, this looks really familiar, except some of the names have changed a little bit. So if you haven't checked out .NET 8 preview yet, this, I believe, used to be the data folder. We still have our traditional weather forecast model in there. Fetch data is now show data for some reason, because I guess the component is showing the data, not so much just fetching it. I don't know. They changed the name of it. It's show data now. And then we have our templates, app.razor, settings, program CS, all that good stuff. All right. So let's dig into some of these again, because they've changed since .NET 7. Let's get a zoom in here, make this nice and big for everybody so you can see well on the stream. Index page doesn't look really any different. Counter page, however, has something new in here. So this is a render server mode attribute. So this is allowing our application to mix WebAssembly and server-side rendering in one project. And one of the things that we can do is we can attribute an entire component and say this component renders on the server and interactivity happens server-side. So that is enabled here. We also have show data, which has streaming rendering enabled. So what this one's going to do is it's going to render the component server side. It's going to continue to do work, which is generating these weather forecasts. And then once the weather forecasts are complete, it will then continue or finish the connection. The way Daniel Roth explained this to me is the component will start transmitting the HTML. Stream rendering is true on it. It will keep that connection open. It will render the page, but not complete the connection until the full content has completed. Then it will update the rendering and then complete the rendering process, or complete that rendering process. So stream rendering is very cool. That is enabled on this project template as well. So things have changed ever so slightly, and I wanted to point these out for a very specific reason that I'll get to in just a minute. So let's just run this for a quick sanity check, make sure everything's working, make sure we don't get any runtime errors. So that way, when we start adding our own code, if it blows up, we know that it's something we did and not just configuration issues or something like that. So we've got this counter example, fetch data. You'll notice it takes kind of a little second to fully display because of that streaming rendering, and there's a fake delay message in there. So if we look in here, there's a wait task delay 1000, kind of simulating some traffic there. So that's the new Blazor template. If we want to take advantage of this new static rendering, again, if we wanted to render something, one of these components as an email, or render the component and save it to disk as HTML on disk, we can do that with this new feature, enabling it is going to take just a little bit of work, not too much, just a little bit. First thing I'm going to do is jump over to Program CS. We need to make sure that we have all of our required services in place. One of those services is the debugging, or not debugging, logging service. So we need to go into our builder up here and make sure that the logger service is injected into dependency injection. So we want to say builder services add logging, and that's going to give us access to an instance of the iLogger interface. So that, I believe, is all we need to do in our program CS file. The next thing we need to do is jump over to where we want to use this. And again, this can be on an HTML or a web API controller. It could be in a console app. I'm going to do it right here in a Razor component, just because it's where I'm comfortable. And we probably need to be a server-side rendered component if you're really going to want to make use of this. You could probably run it WebAssembly, but you can't really, I don't think you can send an email from WebAssembly itself without exposing service keys and things like that. You'd probably want to do that off of a HTTP endpoint or something. If you're doing Blazor server, though, everything is running right there on the server anyway. You can comfortably work in here without exposing anything to the client. I want to run some code in here that is going to read a component, render it, and then we would theoretically get a service to send that as an email body or something. So the first thing we need to do is get the new HTML renderer. And actually, we need to inject some services first. And I pasted some code in chat from Daniel Roth's GitHub repo. If you're just joining me on stream and you didn't get that and you want to look at that code, I can paste it in chat again. But essentially, we're looking at this piece here. It's also in the blog post for Preview 3's release. And it was this section here. So we need the iService provider and the logger factory. Those both get passed into a new HTML renderer. JP era, I don't know if that's a name or it's short for something, Japiro. Looking to eliminate the time users and search engines need to wait for content to appear. The new pre-rendering would enable components to be rendered as static HTML at build time. The new pre-rendering method that is in .NET 8 would help with this. It renders the page server side, and that wouldn't be like your client side rendered where it's the HTML. Well, here, let's see. I'll show you in the browser before we write any code here. Let's see if I can get this right. So if I look at this page and I inspect it, this is, or not inspect it, if I do view source, there we go. This is what the web crawlers tend to see and what causes SEO issues. And this one was server-side rendered, so you don't get those issues. You get the full page here. It says, hello world, welcome to your new app. It's exactly what we would expect to see in here. And if it was client-side rendered, let's see if I can switch this up with an attribute. Render server mode. Let's see if I can do an attribute of render mode WebAssembly. Let's try that. And we'll run the app again, and let's see if we get this hello world text here on handled exception. Enable provider. All right, I'm kind of new to this mode of like being able to render both. I think I'm missing something in, let's see, map razor components. I might need a service in here. Add server components, add razor components, add, we have those. I don't know what the service would be. You're supposed to be able to mix these things together, but it is a beta build, so you might not be able to do that yet. Instead, what I'll do, let's go ahead and really quick, it's a great question, so I want to answer it the right way. The right way to do that is just to bring up a brand new Blazor WebAssembly project and show you the difference between the two. So Blazor WebAssembly app. Next. This is just going to be a quick throwaway project. I'm going to go to standard, and that should be good enough. And we'll go ahead and run that. And I just want to show you the hello world page and what the difference between server-side and client-side rendering is going to look like to a web crawler. I don't need to sync that. Thank you very much. All right. So we'll move that guy over there. And then let me open the other project. And we will run that one again. And let me turn off the, nope, that is not the right page, not the right project. This one is the right one. Let me take this render mode WebAssembly off. That is not quite working the way I thought it would. We'll run that. Okay, so we've got two apps running now. The one on the left is server-side rendered. The one on the right is client-side WebAssembly rendered. If I do a view source, and it's important to do view source, not inspect. Inspect is going to give you the current altered page. If I do inspect or view source, this is going to give me the initial payload that was seen by the browser. And the one on the left that was server-side rendered, notice it has more content in it. Inside the body, on this side over here, inside the body is all of the fully rendered page, where on this side, we've got a progress loading SVG. So there's no body content on the WebAssembly side of it. So this was rendered by WebAssembly. So when the initial web crawler hits this, if it doesn't wait for the page to get rendered, it's only going to see this loading indicator. Where when it's rendered by the server, it gets the entire body that we expect the web crawler to ingest and use for SEO. So you want to try to render stuff on the server with server pre-rendering if you can. What's nice about .NET 8 is it should be able to pre-render and do WebAssembly after the page has already been pre-rendered by the server and not cause us a bunch of extra code to write. You can do some of this in .NET 7 already. but there's some extra steps that you need to take. Things should get a lot easier in .NET 8. So hopefully that answered the question. So back to writing some code here. We need to get some services. And again, that code was on the .NET 8 preview blog or Daniel Roth's GitHub page. We need to get these services, the iService Provider and the iLogger Factory. He's doing it here in a console app, so this is what it would look like in a console app. We're in an actual Blazor component, Razor component. So we want to come up here and say inject, and we want the iLogger. Was it iLogger Factory, or was it the provider? I have to look back at the docs again. iLogger Factory and Service Provider. Don't know exactly why it needs the logger factory, but it does. The service provider makes sense in case there are services that need to be used to render the component. And this one's the iService Provider itself. Let's call that one services. I find it interesting it takes the entire service provider and not just the service collection. But that's what it asks for, so that's what we're going to give it. So we've got those two services set up. Let's try to move this to the side for a second, just so it's a little bit easier for me to go back and forth. And actually, I can move this off screen if that would help. Let me move it to my other monitor. You'll probably just see me looking away quite a bit. So we need to next use the HTML renderer. And we need some kind of method here. I don't want to do this on startup. I want to have maybe a button or something that I can click to invoke this. So let's set a button up. And we'll say send email. And this will be an on click. And eventually we would want to send an email with that. So we're going to say send email. And then we need a private task async task send email. All right. And then we can move the code in there. And we can say await using var render HTML renderer new HTML renderer logger factory and logger services go in there, and now we have access to the HTML render. So this is where we need to render the actual component, and we will do that through setting up a variable called HTML. This is going to be our output. We're going to say await the HTML renderer, take the dispatcher property and invoke async on it. And then we need to, inside this method, declare the output HTML renderer render component async. This is where I'm going to pass in my email template component, which we haven't defined yet, and we can assign any parameters to it. That will output to HTML string. That gets passed back to our HTML variable there, and we should be able to just access that and do what we want with it. So we don't have a email service yet. So we would send that email after we parse it all out. Right now, I'm just going to do a console.writeLine and say HTML. So we can put a breakpoint on it and just see what's coming out of that process. So we need a component to render. We got a little ahead of ourselves. Let's try rendering the counter component and see what happens. And we don't have a parameter for that. So our parameter for this one is going to be empty. All right. So hopefully this is starting to make a little bit of sense. We have a button. We're going to click the button. Let's see. There we go. Click the button. Send an email. We set up the HTML renderer by newing up a new renderer object here. It takes our services and logger factory. We hook into the dispatcher process here and invoke async on it. Hey, Aztec Consulting, welcome. So we are looking at static rendering with Blazor and Razor components, and how you can take a Razor component, render that out to static HTML, and do stuff with it. So we're just going over the work that we just did in a index component, that when we click on an email button, it is going to try to render this component, the counter component. So it's going to take and await the HTML render, render the component async. It takes the counter component. There's no parameters here to worry about, so that's empty. Then finally it returns the rendered, whatever comes off of this. I need to see what kind of, it's probably an I something or other, and then we say to HTML string, and that to HTML string gets passed back into that variable there, which then we write to the console. Hopefully that explained it. What is the output here? An HTML root component. That is what comes out of the HTML renderer when we call render component async. So we take that HTML root component to HTML string it, then we can work with it. Let's see what happens when we run this. So I'm going to hit run. And again, we're on .NET 8 preview, and I've got that new funky new Blazor template that's got the funky render server stuff on it. Let's do inspect here and watch the console. And when I hit send email, nothing happened. Let's try that again. I'm not getting anything at all. So this is one of those, one of the new kind of catches with this new template. So I haven't defined whether this is server-side or client-side interactive yet. So there's no interactivity. It's just a rendered page. It's a server-side rendered page. To make this interactive, and again, this is a .NET 8 thing that you can opt into, and I happen to have done that just so I could show you how it works today. We need to say that this is a render mode server page, and that will enable our button to be clickable. So that's why the button didn't do anything, and we didn't see any errors in the console window, because it just literally wasn't doing anything at all. There was no interactivity on that because it was just rendering the page for us. That's all Blazor was doing in that instance. Now it's an interactive Blazor page, and it's a server interactive Blazor page. So now I can say send email, and there's an error in the console. We also have our yellow banner at the bottom. If I get my tool out here, you can see yellow banner at the bottom, error here. The error message is very vague because error messages are disabled. So it says there was an unhandled exception in the current circuit. The circuit will be terminated. For more details, turn on detailed errors true in app settings.development.json. So that's a pretty common thing to see. So we'll stop the app from running and we'll open app settings development JSON. And inside of here, we need to add detailed errors to true. And then we can go back, repeat the process, and see what the actual error was so we can fix it. So I'm going to inspect the page again, click our send email button. Console blows up with lots of stuff now. And it says cannot supply a component of type Blazor email pages counter gives a full namespace, the counter component, because the current platform does not support the render mode of, let's see, I lost my space there. It does not support the render mode of server render mode, blah, 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 blah. So what this really boils down to is when I hit send email, we're actually trying to render the counter component, which is a server interactive component. And it is server-side rendered with this render server mode, and it's interactive. It's waiting, for interactivity. This is not something we can render to a static HTML stream. So what we need to do is actually come up with a component that doesn't have this server render mode on it. And I'm going to create a very specific component that will eventually be an HTML template, email template. So let's go ahead and do a new Razor component. And I'm going to call that one email template. And the email template is not going to have the not streaming rendering or even render server mode. It's going to have nothing defined, which is just going to be, I want to render it, and that's it. It's just going to be rendered. It's not this interactive page, either server or WebAssembly. It's just a rendered component. I want to say a message here. So I actually want to pass some values to it. Otherwise, this is just pretty useless. Parameter. And we will say this is going to be a public string of message. Yay, IntelliSense worked this time. All right. So we're going to render some message in an H3 tag, and that's going to be our component for now. We'll look at something a little bit more complex in a few. We want to go back here and change this counter component to email template. And then the parameter view is empty here. We want to actually set up a parameter so we can pass some values in to the into the component there. And to do that, it's a little clunky. We actually need to put the parameters in a dictionary. So we're going to say dictionary. We have a message parameter, and we want a message to be hello from the component or whatever, render message component. And the dictionary, then we can pass into this parameter view over here using the parameter view dot from dictionary. I don't know if there will be an easier way to write these parameter views, but this one is a little clunky, especially when the formatting starts going nuts. There we go. So we've got our email template. We'll pass in our dictionary to it, so it'll grab message and assign that message to it. And then the console right line should have that rendered string to it. So let's take a look. And it keeps coming up on the other monitor, which drives me nuts every show. There we go. So now if I click send email, I should hit a breakpoint. So no more errors. That's good. And the rendered HTML here, if we look, is H3, hello from render message component. So we're starting to get somewhere. If we really wanted to build an HTML email, I don't know if you've ever done HTML emails. They're not fun to work with. The browser support that is inside of something like Gmail or Outlook isn't too kind to HTML. It wants like HTML like 4 or something like that. I don't know why these things are so out of date, but they are. So I would highly recommend like getting an email template from somewhere, and or having someone you hire to do it. So let's just do free email template. I had one earlier from this HubSpot blog post. And is this the correct one? It is not. That is not the right one. Advanced is a great place if you want to buy email templates. They have like a subscription service that you can do, and you just unlimited downloads of these really nice looking templates. Those are out there. I'm trying to find what I had earlier, though. I found a free one that I could just copy and paste in for an example. Let's see if I can figure out where that went. Just so we have something to work with. Let's see, give me 1 sec while I look this back up. And actually, it was in CodePen. I remember that much about it, so maybe... Okay, search did not work for me on that one either. Come on. Unfortunately, I had to reboot my computer right before the start, and I had it up in a tab. Come on, CodePen. Where's that CodePen at I had? If anybody knows of a nice email template, there we go. Here's one on CodePen. So here is a responsive email template that we could use. And I'm going to grab that and move it over to email template.razor. And we'll drop that in here. And this is a very big chunk of email, or a very big chunk of HTML. And this is why they're so kind of gnarly to work with, is they have the style sheets embedded directly in them. And what we would need to do is come through this and set up all of our Razor component or Razor parameters in here and bind the data. So let's see. This is the pre-header wrapper. There, use tables to outline these things still. So in here would be where our message would go. So you could say that's where the message is. There's some logos. There might be some images and things that you want to bring in. Another thing like you might want to do is like email a report or something. Kind of caveat with that is in an email, you would want to make sure that you render like an SVG or an image with like any kind of charts and visualizations, that they're actual images and not actual like JavaScript based or Blazor-based components that need like WebAssembly or JavaScript to run, because you're not going to get that in an email. So you would need to render those out to an actual image and embed them in the email as an image. And you wouldn't have any interactivity on those charts and graphs and things. But at least with an image, you can generate a report and send it type of thing. If you're using something like Telerik UI for Blazor, you can always use the PDF generation tools. You could generate a PDF on the server and attach it to an email and send your reports that way, and that's a really nice way to do that as well. But basically what you would do is go through all of these fields wherever you want to set up a parameter, and you would just have like message 2, message 3, or whatever semantic meaning you want to give these. This one's like a header message, subheader message, hero image, main paragraph. You'd want to go in your parameters down here and just keep setting these up for whatever kind of text you want. So you would have like this header message, body message, footer message, and so on. And then you can pass those various parameters in and replace them. But what's nice is we can actually use Blazor for this. So I can come in and say footer message. And where was the body at for this one? There was like a main paragraph. These things are really complex. And you could split these out into subcomponents too. The render, I believe, will render any child component. So you could make this a little bit easier to read if you wanted to abstract some of this out and just kind of focus on the templatable regions of this. So here's the main paragraph here. We would just say at message. What other properties did we have? It was message, body message. Another thing that you might run into in these email templates too, I don't know if there's any in here, like if there's an email section in here, like an email address, make sure you escape those. So the @ symbol is going to be troublesome in an email template. So you'd want to kind of deal with that as well. But this gives you general ideas. We've got 3 messages in here now. We go back and set up those 3 messages. We would just duplicate this line here. And it would be header. How did I write those out again? This is the only part I don't like, is this. We don't get IntelliSense. So we say header, body, and footer. And that would replace those 3 sections there. As far as sending the email, let's go ahead and run this one more time, make sure we didn't break anything. We did. There's media does not exist in the current context. Probably one of those @ things. Yeah. So there's a media query in here. So I want to escape that. And then, oh, this message was the header message. At least the compiler caught those mistakes. So now we can try that again. And now we've got a huge body of text here. That would be our email body. Last thing I want to do is just kind of look and see. How would you use SendGrid from ASP.NET? See if I've got like an API or something like that I could look at just to give an idea of what this is. This is a really bad example. If I put it in Visual Studio, it might look a little bit better. Twilio's got something they can. There we go. Sending with .NET 6. That should be. So you set up your account, and then this is what the API would look like. This is better. So you set up your API key. This is the part that I said you wouldn't want to do this in WebAssembly, even if you probably could, because you want to be able to get API keys and stuff and do that on the server where it's going to be safe. So you do new SendGrid message in email subject, plain text content. This plain text content would be your email body. Actually, I don't. Might be this one. Nope, that's email address. Yeah. So it'd be here, you would replace with your HTML you got from your component. And I believe that would be your email body. So this would be in our component like this. Let's go over. We don't have the actual service. We'll just go ahead and kind of paste it in here, though, and take a look. And we would do it like that. We'll go ahead and comment these out or something, but for all intents and purposes, instead of console.writeLine, this HTML bit would go here, right there. So we would have our API key, new up a email client, construct a message, put the from email, the subject, pass in our HTML from our component, add any other email addresses, and then do send email async, passing in that constructed message, and there we go. So that would read our Blazor or Razor component email template, fill in the parameters from here, and then create the email and send it out through SendGrid. We used to be able to do this just with plain .NET. You didn't have to have SendGrid, but there was too many, I guess, dependencies on the operating system with .NET Core, so they Microsoft kind of made the decision to decouple it and let third-party vendors fill in that space. There's SendGrid and there's others. SendGrid's probably one of the more popular ones. Twilio's got a good kind of history with .NET and Microsoft and doing things with the .NET framework. So, yeah, there's some nice samples here too on the Twilio page. So it makes it nice and easy. Very cool. Any questions, folks, in the chat? How are we doing in chat today? Did this make sense, hopefully? It's a really cool new feature for .NET. And then this is something that I found as a practical example. But if you want to go off the rails with this and create like a static site generation tool, you could do something like that as well. The only difficulty I find with all of this is the way you pass in parameters. Seems a little clunky. Hopefully you can put these in. We can even try this and see if we could do something like a model here, and then just pass in an entire model instead of each parameter. That might be more helpful. That would be something I would want to try. So we need, let's go into models, say add new class. We'll call it email template model, just to keep it nice and generic and simple. And then we have prop. Got several strings here, and their header message, body message and footer message. So this might give us a little more IntelliSense. In the email template, we would need to modify this and just have one parameter here. And this would be a email template model. And then we would just say model. And then we'd have to update all of the places we used that. To model dot like that. And hopefully this would make things so much easier. There's the footer. We have one more floating around here somewhere. These are hard to find in this HTML soup. There it is, header message, model.header message. Take out that @ symbol. There we go. And then back over to index, and we should be able to say new model email template model. There we go. Header message. So this gives you a little more IntelliSense. I like that better. It gives you a lot less parameters to pass in. It's a little more realistic coming out of another system too. Because usually something is generating this model, a form, database information, something. So you wouldn't necessarily new it up in line like this. It would come out of some method, and then you just say the model is whatever the output of that database method was, and we'll pass that in as the model and render that as an HTML email and send it off. So that looks like it worked just fine. And we should have, it'd probably be easy to find in the footer here, or not. These things are like HTML mud. Should just say like body message in here somewhere. I can't just do a find either. But I would imagine it's writing this out just fine. Even though I haven't been able to see it. Oh, there is an @ symbol that got successfully rendered out. I'm surprised that didn't cause an error. I can see some email addresses in here. But there you go. That's how we would do it. All right, folks, you can keep an eye on that stuff at the MS Dev blogs, or the dev blogs.microsoft.com, where all of the .NET previews have been taking place. And then I should probably mention, if you go to telerik.com, you'll see this nice little flyout banner that comes up. We've got some workshops coming up. These are going to be really detailed workshops on how to do migration. Maybe you're planning to migrate to Blazor or .NET MAUI from some existing ASP.NET application. I've got a workshop that I just developed for this where we're taking a web forms application running on .NET Framework 4.8 and moving that to Blazor on .NET 7. So those are coming up in September. If you want to learn more about modernizing with MAUI, that's coming up in September as well with Sam Basu and I. So make sure you register for those. I'll drop those into chat. So if you want to jump on with us that day and do a little workshop, we've got that lined up for you. And that concludes another Blazor Power Hour. Hopefully that was an interesting one since we dealt with some Blazor preview .NET 8 stuff. And we will talk to you again next week, hopefully for another Blazor Power Hour. If you've got any suggestions, hit me up on social media or in chat here. Let me know what you'd like to see, and we can try to chat about it. I want to learn a little bit more about the Blazor pre-rendering server-side, client-side stuff. Couldn't quite get it to work the way I thought it would work today, so we'll play around with that maybe in the future. It might have been user error, it might just not be fully implemented yet because it is a preview, and I know there were some bits that weren't quite ready because of that. So we'll check it out again in the future and see what happens. Take care, everybody. We'll see you again soon.